الله أكبر الله أكبر.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My topic today, inshallah ta'ala, our topic will be Liberalism, 21st century Jahiliyya. Now, as we know, liberalism has attained following the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, right, in the defeat of its only competing ideology, Marxism. It has attained hegemonic status in that it does not only lay within political systems, it does not only shape political systems, but it also controls or shapes economic orders, institutions, political cultures, and even our sensibilities, and even the principles of our rationality. And of course, considering the massive intellectual and spiritual bankruptcy pervading the Muslim world, liberalism has found its way into our societies and permeated both Muslim and secular intelligentsia and elite, to the extent that amidst the enfeeblement, defeatism, inferiority complex which ravages the Muslim world, or ravages our academia, quote-unquote, our intellectuals, many quote-unquote intellectuals subconsciously or consciously try to superimpose liberal values on Islam, or in other words, try to confine Islam's unitary, holistic, and grand worldview, its unitary paradigm, into the confines of liberalism's shallow, fragmented, and superficial reductivist worldview or paradigm. In light of this existential crisis, this identity crisis, and this ideological onslaught which the West is waging against Islam and the Muslim world and against the divine dictum of Tawheed, we found it crucial and incumbent upon us that we examine liberalism from an Islamic perspective, or as we said in line, or as we said in an earlier talk about Thought at Ramadan, or that we examine liberalism or any political doctrine for that matter within the lines of the Islamic methodology or the imperatives of the Islamic methodology. Now, briefly, inshallah ta'ala, as we mentioned previously in the recent interview with Brother Yunus on the website about deconstructing modernity, what are the methodological imperatives of Islam in dealing with the other, right? So, ما هو المنهج الإسلامي? What is the Islamic methodology or the criteria that we use when we examine political doctrines or when we want to deal with other societies? The first of these, my brothers and sisters, is what we call al-mufasala. Mufasala, and this is what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did in Mecca. In other words, it is to draw the conceptual boundaries between the Islamic paradigm and the Jahili paradigm, the Islamic discourse and the Jahili discourse. And this was explicitly clear in Mecca when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ revealed the verses, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ. Right? This was a clear demarcation of what is Islam and what is not Islam, till the end of the surah, لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ وَلِيَ دِينِ. And then in other verses in the Quran also which clearly demarcate what is the Islamic paradigm and what is not Islamic paradigm. Verses such as قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي إِدْعُ إِلَى اللَّهِ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ أَنَا وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَنِي, or قُلْ هَذِهِ صِرَاطٌ مُسْتَقِيمًا فَاتَّبِعُوهُ. So this is the first step, al-mufasala, and drawing the conceptual boundaries between Islam and other paradigms, understanding what are the confines or the restrictions of your paradigm and what are the restrictions and the confines of the alien or exterior paradigm. Number two, the second step, is examining the ontological and epistemological worldview or foundations of the doctrine or the society that you are dealing with. Because Islam is not a superficial religion, Islam is a practical religion. And if you look at the Quranic methodology and the way that the Quran or the way that Allah Azza wa Jal deals with other philosophies or other ideologies, the methodology is that we penetrate the exteriorities, the superficialities of a political doctrine, and we examine its ontological and its epistemological foundations. Ontological in this case being mafhum al-uluhiyya, the concept of servitude, the concept of God or the nature of God, and the understanding of God or divinity in these political doctrines. So again, this is the second step, examining, in line with the Quranic methodology and the Quranic discourse, examining the ontological and epistemological foundations of these political doctrines, amongst them liberalism, because it does not suffice that we do as social theorists do, or as some reductivists do. It does not suffice that we look at or we put an emphasis on culture, because this does not get us anywhere. And a lot of people, such as, for example, Edward Said or Tariq Ramadan, who claim that there is a clash of ignorance or a clash of perceptions, are thinking within a Western paradigm, and they are unable to transcend this Western paradigm. Hence, their emphasis is on Islamic culture, Islamic history, right, or liberal culture and liberal history. And again, this is a very reductivist understanding of political doctrines, and they do not examine the ontological reality-shaping foundations of these political doctrines. And lastly, the third step in the Islamic methodology, before we move on, is that we elucidate, right, and expound a purely Islamic discourse, meaning a discourse which stems from an Islamic paradigm, which is referential to an Islamic ontology, Tawheed, right, our ontology is Tawheed, and to an Islamic epistemology, which in our case is Al-Wahy, revelation from Allah Azza wa Jal, the interface to which is Al-Aql, which is a cosmic interface for Al-Wahy. So let's just sum those up, inshallah ta'ala. We said number one, the first step in Islamic methodology is a mufassala. This is explicitly clear in the prophetic methodology. This means to draw the conceptual boundaries between the Islamic paradigm and the other paradigms, or the external and alien paradigms. Step two is to examine the ontological and epistemological reality-shaping foundation, or the worldview, of various political doctrines which we are dealing with, in our case, or in the West today, secular liberalism. So we have to examine the ontological and epistemological foundations of secular liberalism, and this is what we will do in this paper, inshallah ta'ala. The third step is to expound a purely Islamic discourse based on the Islamic paradigm and derived from the Islamic paradigm, which is self-referential to an Islamic epistemology and Islamic ontology, and there's no cut between the stem and the furu'a, the root and the branches. The root in this being Tawheed, and the branches being the epistemology, being Sharia. So, in light of this, we will look at the second step, inshallah, which we spoke about, i.e. the examining of the ontological and epistemological foundations of the liberal West. And in doing so, Islam sets up a binary template, right? A society or a doctrine can either be Islamic or it can be Jahiliyya, meaning it can either have an ignorance in regards to its understanding of the Islamic ontology, or its understanding of the nature of Allah Azza wa Jal, or our worship of Allah Azza wa Jal, or the sovereignty of Allah and Islamic epistemology, or it can be aware, or it can have yaqeen in it. Now, saying this and setting the criteria or the standards by which we will judge liberalism, we come to realize that it is in fact the epitome of Jahiliyya. Its profound ignorance of the nature of Allah Azza wa Jal, or the reality of Allah Azza wa Jal. Its ignorance about the reality and the requirements of society is actually perplexing to the Muslim mind, right, who has a subliminal concept of reality and understanding of human nature, human society, and absolute reality. So inshallah ta'ala, in this lecture or in this short talk, we will examine a few of liberalism's many inconsistencies. For example, its ontological ignorance, right, or its ignorance about the true nature of Allah, in which it seeks to turn an omnipotent God, Allah Azza wa Jal, it seeks to create this omnipotent God into a personal God, while making claims or claiming that it is ontological. It in fact makes a huge ontological move by shifting authority into the public flux, shifting authority from the divine, from the transient, from Allah Azza wa Jal, right? Shifting the source of morality from being from Allah into the public flux, or what Kant called the public square, right? Where authority and command are no longer in the hands of a transient being, but they now belong to the autonomous individual being, who apparently, or according to Kant and some liberal thinkers, has a supersensible self, which is autonomous and which has power to be autonomy, and which can derive morality alone, independently of any divine intervention or of any divine source. Now, inshallah, we will look at later in the paper, later into the talk, how this is in fact a myth and a facade. Now, first, inshallah ta'ala, we can just start off by showing that even with any, we do not even have to look at liberalism from an Islamic perspective or from within an Islamic discursive framework to realize that it is a false false, self-referentially incoherent ideology, because it bases itself on a self-referentially incoherent premise. The whole philosophy of liberalism lies on the concept of individualism, which, as Charles Taylor points out in several of his articles and several of his works, and Talal Asad also elucidates upon this point, and Rene Gonon and a lot of the postmodernist theories who criticize modernity and liberalism being an expression of modernity, that this premise, this philosophical foundation of liberalism, i.e. individualism, is in and of itself incoherent and false. So the very philosophical foundation of liberalism is self-referentially incoherent and is based on a false reality, this notion that man can be autonomous or can exist independent of his social construct. Secondly, inshallah, if we look at some of the justifications for liberalism, its primary justification is that it vindicates human dignity. However, on both the practical and theoretical level, this is fallacious and far from the truth. By reducing reality and existence, as liberalism does, to the individual and denying the existence of any objective conception of goodness, it destroys any basis upon which equality, justice, and dignity can exist. On a practical level, high pursuits and lofty aims of man are reduced to slavish conformity of the masses, in which high culture is replaced by popular culture, dominated by exploitations of instincts and desires. An ethos of dry materialism pervades this culture. It rejects any notion of a higher principle and elevates its political culture of man's self-autonomy and moral being to that of a metaphysical being. By doing so, it leaves man with no higher purpose whatsoever. Hence, liberalism, and this is a very important point, and this explains why so many people were attracted to Marxism. Liberalism lacks an interpretive orientation as Marxism did. Man cannot then transcend his immediate self in determining moral ends or questions related to ethics. This shallowness and the moral vacuum was even admitted and explained by Fukuyama, who boasted that there would be an end of history, one of the major liberal theorists of our age. And he has acknowledged that within liberalism, there is a moral vacuum, as we said, and this is again what drew many intellectuals and many thinkers from the West, especially in the 1920s. And we all hear of the McCarthy scare, because Marxism, for example, allows man to transcend his immediate politics or his immediate politics of desires, and orients man through the false notion of historical materialism. Now, liberalism's reduction of man to the likes of cattle or of herd, like Allah Azza wa Jalla says, and such are like cattle, nay, they are more astray, and even Nietzsche described democratic societies as such. So liberalism, or this culture of instincts and desires, becomes raised to the level of a political culture. It is embodied in a political culture and in a philosophical idea, i.e. liberal theory. So if these Islamic thinkers, like the likes of Tariq Ramadan, Hassan al-Bibi, and other quote-unquote Muslim intellectuals who douse their discourse of liberal theory, truly want what is best for humanity and to elevate man, we cannot see or we cannot understand or fathom why they find it incumbent upon themselves to import the liberal paradigm, which does not vindicate human dignity but rather destroys human dignity. And this can be represented if we look at the civilization which we live in today, or at least within the West. For the first time, we have a civilization which, as Renaud Gonon puts it, is based on something quote-unquote purely negative, and something quote-unquote an absence of a principle. In other words, for the first time, we had a society which is based on a negation of any principle higher than that of the individual. Truth was translated into practical utility, and morality into relativity. For example, one thinker said, "It is highly significant that there is no longer any question here of truth, but only of reality. Reality being reduced to exclusively a sensible order, and conceived as something essentially moving and unstable. Now, religion in the West, and especially in our day and age, amidst liberalism, has taken a backseat to public affairs and was reduced to mere ritualism and sentimentalism, and at most a social convention. Protestantism itself being an expression of modernity and an attempt to humanize religion. Now, I'm going back to the foundational principle or the foundational premise of liberalism, i.e., individualism. It is important that we note or that you understand that liberalism or individualism is not merely a reflection, that liberalism is in fact, or individualism is a reflection of a pervading mentality which existed during the Enlightenment, or the quote-unquote Enlightenment, which was man's rebellion against tradition, which is indeed nothing more than, as one European thinker put it, a mutilating emancipation, or a theophobic individualism. As a matter of fact, individualism in its classical humanism form is perhaps the most honest expression of modernity, in that it reduces reality to I. We all know Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am," i.e., reality was reduced to the individual. And in doing so, it quote-unquote creates an illusory center outside the real, placing the beginning and the end with man, and these have tremendous implications. Now, this, as we said, has major implications, amongst it being that reality becomes translated into materiality, or for example, as Julius Evola put it, quote unquote, the only thing that was still regarded as all-inclusive and certain was the material view of the world or nature, seen as exteriority and a collection of phenomena. Now, some might consider this an oversimplification of some forms of liberalism, such as a Kantian liberal might argue this. However, it does reflect many predominant strands within liberal thought. The truth in liberalism is determined by an established criterion, which is a degenerated number of atomized, self-interested individuals engrossed in an organic mass popular culture, and nothing ties them together except desires, instincts, and, as we said, an aggregation of atomized individuals which cannot transcend their immediate self on any any principles of ethics or morality, which transcend the man's direct desires. Now, inshallah, our last 2 points are that 1, liberalism cannot vindicate human dignity as it claims to do, inshallah. And the second point is that there are actually no grounds or foundations for liberalism's claims to vindicate human dignity. Its claims towards natural rights or natural equality of man. In regards to human dignity, early liberal thinkers tried to set forth the notion of the social contract, and I'm sure we're all aware of this. We've all heard of this idea of a social contract, whether it's Locke, Rousseau, or Thomas Hobbes. And this basically implied that the state of nature was evidence of God, or a transcendental authority for that matter. And the idea was that God was neutral in regards to political authority, or they saw that the state of nature was indicative that God was indeed, or Allah Azza wa Jalla was neutral in his temporal sovereignty. So man, inherently good or not, must therefore form a contract so that he may preserve his property and freedom. Their freedom, as in freedom from bondages to higher authority. So the social contract is then needed to preserve man's dignity. But as Kreinak, for example, a Christian thinker, points out, Locke admits as much when he says there is no essential trait such as the possession of a rational soul that clearly distinguishes human beings from other animals and directs them towards rational perfection as a natural end. So the question is, on what grounds can human dignity stand? It is not surprising that Rousseau referred to the ethos or the culture of liberal democracy as one which is concerned with commerce and with trade. So here one sees the epitome of ignorance when liberalism is unable to define what is man, or what is intrinsic to man, or what is human nature, or what makes humans different than animals or than other creatures, which in the Quran is made explicitly clear. So again, it is very surprising and perplexing why we still have some Muslim intellectuals who have a manifest guide towards cosmic reality and towards transcendental truth, to the current requirements of society, the constant immutable requirements of society, and the essence of nature of humans, as explicitly made clear and elucidated in the Quran. We still have quote-unquote Muslim intellectuals who are trying to adopt or superimpose this liberal paradigm, which is based on ignorance and skepticism, onto the Islamic paradigm. Someone who tried to solve this or tried to give liberalism more of a stronger grounding, as we said with Locke, there was no metaphysical grounding because he believed that God was neutral in regard to political authority, was Immanuel Kant. He played a major role in trying to provide, like I said, a metaphysical or a philosophical grounding to secularism and liberalism. However, his whole argument relies on a crucial question. Again, he was a skeptic. He followed Hume. He was a student of Hume. The crucial question was, do humans have free will? If so, his argument may stand. If not, then it crumbles. The problem is that Kant is committed to skeptical reason, as we said, hence he cannot provide any positive proof for freedom and autonomy, but only negative. Hence, his whole justification is then based on an assumption of how we might act if we were self-autonomous free beings. With this, of course, Kant bases his negative proof on his realization that our reason cannot grasp ultimate realities. Hence, on no basis can free will be disproven. So basically, what liberals, the liberal argument for free will is that, well, our minds are limited, hence they cannot grasp reality in and of itself. Hence, the same way we cannot prove free will, we cannot disprove free will. And again, this is based on certain ontological and epistemological assumptions. This is based on the epistemological assumption that there is no means or there is no revealed knowledge by which we can understand free will, or whether we can reach an agreement or a consensus on whether we have free will or not, or whether humans are autonomous or not. And regarding Immanuel Kant, Locke, and Rousseau, inshallah ta'ala, in the near future we can release a very lengthy exposition of all of their thought, and we can show to what extent and how incoherent and inconsistent each of these philosophers were, and that none of them, and I repeat, none of them could provide grounding or any sort of objective, philosophical, hard grounding for their claims towards equality, freedom, autonomy, or rights. And this brings us to our last question: on what grounds do natural rights stand? We know nature and biology is amoral, and we know that, whether if we want to look at it from the secular perspective, that relativism and secular sociology and an exposure to the world, exposure of world wars which crippled Europe, prove to us that naturally men are not equal. So this idea of basing this notion of all men are born equal on nature has been largely exposed as a myth, even by liberals themselves, among some Margaret Canavan. And again, this is elucidated, or Talal Asad in his masterpiece, his very, very good work called Formations of the Secular, also explains that liberalism is in and of itself based on major myths, amongst it this idea of natural rights. So inshallah ta'ala, we'll suffice with this inshallah, and I'll just briefly summarize what we tried to do today. But we did it again, we said, in light of the hegemonic status which liberalism has attained, and in light of this ideological war which is raging today between the Islamic world, between the Islamic movements, and between the Muslim thinkers, the true Muslim thinkers, who bring life to their words, to their own blood, amidst this ideological war between Islam and the West. This war taking the form of an ideological war and of a military war. And we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal gives victory to our brothers on both fronts, our brothers and sisters on both fronts, including our brothers on the military front. In light of this cosmic battle between Islam and Jahiliyya, it is incumbent upon us that we again look at liberalism, or this global hegemony which is trying to destroy the Islamic identity. It's important that we look at it from an Islamic perspective, and we said one of the methodological imperatives for doing so is that we look at the ontological and epistemological foundations of liberalism. And according to the Islamic criteria, or according to the Islamic worldview, any system or worldview whose ontology is not tawheed and whose epistemology is not revealed knowledge, is not revelation, and intellect, i.e. Tawheed and al-Wahy, Quran, and the Sunnah of our Prophet Muhammad is Jahiliyya. And this is again the Islamic binary template, which separates, which creates a binary that a society or a doctrine can either be Islamic or Jahiliyya, again based on its ontological and epistemological foundations. And then what we did is we examined the false premise which liberalism is based on, i.e. individualism, which has been largely debunked. Then we looked at some of the philosophical inconsistencies within liberalism, and that liberalism claims to be neutral or deontological, but in fact it tries to remove authority from being with Allah Azza wa Jal, with a transient being, to within the public square. And it tries to remove morality from being something which belongs to Allah Azza wa Jal, or the transient being, to that which belongs to the self-autonomous, quote-unquote, the quote-unquote self-autonomous individual, which Kant spoke of, and has been debunked by his own students, amongst them neoliberals of our age. And then lastly, we examined liberal civilization, some of its foundations, some of its characteristics and traits, and then we looked at some of the claims of liberalism, such as its claim towards vindicating human dignity and natural rights, and we saw that these are in fact myths, fallacious, because liberalism cannot even, because it is based on ignorance and it is based on skepticism, it cannot define, one, what is nature, let alone what is human, let alone what is the essence of man, and what are the requirements of society. Jazakumullahu khairan. Inshallah ta'ala, as I said, in the near future we will release a much more lengthy exposition of liberalism, and also explain the Islamic methodology in more detail, so that the Muslim youth, in light of this war or this cosmic battle today between us and Jahiliyya, or between Islam and the West and the secular West, at the forefront of which are these quote-unquote modernist Muslims, which are more like intellectual prostitutes, in light of this war, inshallah ta'ala, we will give the youth a set of, as I said, methodological imperatives, or the Islamic methodology in dealing with the enemies of Islam and the enemies of Allah Azza wa Jal. Jazakum Allahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.